Good evening, everybody. Hi, I'm Michael Heaston. I'm the head of music staff here at the Dallas Opera. I'm also the assistant conductor for this production of The Magic Flute. It's my pleasure to be with you. This is my 5th season here, but this is actually the first pre-opera lecture I've given here. So I'm very excited to do this for you. I do this at every other company I work for, so it's time to add Dallas in since this is my home company. So we'll have a little fun together today. So as you know, we're here for The Magic Flute, and a masterpiece by Mozart. And there's a few elements of this piece that I want to discuss with you that are going to help you understand even better why this piece is a masterpiece. Consistently worldwide, every year, it's in one of the top 5 list of most frequently performed operas. And there's no real mystery as to why. How many people are seeing Flute for the first time tonight? Which is a fair number, I hope. Good. The reason why I say there is no mystery as to why this is so frequently performed is because Flute is actually full of mystery. And as I tell you just a few things to look for and listen for today, you'll start to see that there's much beneath the surface of this. And the opera can be enjoyed at a surface level. There are moments of great comedy, great tragedy. It's very entertaining, but the symbolism and philosophy that goes into the piece is something that's very fascinating. Mozart lived 1756 to 1791. He was just 35 when he died. When you think of what he accomplished in that short lifetime, it's pretty incredible. But if we look in particular at the final 5 years of his life and the final 5 operas, it's quite the catalog. We have Le Nozze di Figaro, Don Giovanni, Così fan tutte, The Magic Flute, Die Zauberflöte, and La Clemenza di Tito. And actually, many people consider Magic Flute to be the final opera he composed because it premiered last. Clemenza di Tito premiered September 6th. Magic Flute, I believe, was September 30th, but the music for Magic Flute was actually completed before Clemenza di Tito was. But you see, what he would manage to do in just 5 years at the end of his life is pretty incredible. I look at what I've done the last 5 years, and I feel a little embarrassed when I look at that list. I don't know how you feel when you think about your final 5 years here, but here we are. So it's pretty incredible. And when you look at this piece in context of what was not just happening with his own music, but with other music during this time period, it's rather fascinating. Part of the reason this is such an accessible piece is that there is something for everyone in it, especially at the time that this was composed. The styles of music range greatly in the course of this one opera. Mozart took every possible different style of music that was popular at that time and somehow incorporated it into this opera. And it's not just a smattering of different styles. They're styles that relate to the characters. So the characters immediately become something that everybody could associate with, whether they were young, they were old, regardless of what class they were in. There's a character that people can personally identify with. And the music he used for that purpose goes along with it. The first example that I want you to listen to, and you'll hear this style of music throughout the evening from the characters of the Queen of the Night and Sarastro, the priest, comes from a style of opera called opera seria, S-E-R-I-A. Kind of looks like serious opera. That style of opera at that time dealt with mythological, regal sort of characters. And so he employed that style of music in the composition of the arias and ensembles he wrote for these characters. We have the famous Queen of the Night aria here, and you'll see immediately what style of music I'm talking about.
Wirst ihn töten und den mächtigen Sonnenkreis mir überliefern. Aber Mutter! Wart!
utterly charming Diana Damrau singing that. If you don't know her singing, she's someone you should look into. Again, her name is Diana Damrau. Fantastic singer. As you could see in that, the music had a very strong sort of characterization. Her music has a lot of pyrotechnics, these elements of opera seria, big scales, the famous high Fs. Thank God my mother's not like that, or any of our mothers for that matter. The next character is Pamina and Tamino, the prince and princess, are characters from what we call opera buffa, B-U-F-F-A, which makes us think of the word buffoon, but that's not really, it's one of those false cognates where the word looks like something and we think buffoon, but that's not necessarily what it is. That's more of a title of a style of music. And opera buffa focused on using different styles of characters. There was always the leading tenor, the soprano love interest, and there were certain stock character roles that people fulfilled. And that's the kind of music that they also have associated with them. It's a more simpler sort of music than what you just heard. The example of opera buffa I have for you is Tamino's Act 1 aria, Die Bildnis. Looks like a leading tenor. You notice the line is much simpler than the Queen of the Night. So we have this element of serious opera with the regal characters. We have opera buffa with these stock love interest sort of characters. Then what Mozart geniusly weaves throughout this is the element of German popular song at that time, or German Lied, L-I-E-D, meaning song. And we associate that with the character of Papageno, who everyone falls in love with when they see this piece. He's kind of the glue that makes everything work. And Papageno is basically what in German we'd call the Jedermann. He's every man. He's your neighbor. You want to go sit and have a beer with them. You know, you want to cook out a back of baby back ribs and just talk with him about his day, and that's who you want to hang out with. And that's Papageno. And Mozart gives him 3 arias throughout the course, and the melodies for them are very singable. They're things you walk away humming. What he also does to show that this is an everyday character, and notice this, before Papageno sings any of his arias, the orchestra plays the entire tune all the way first as the introduction. Then he sings the aria. So it's very much like teaching someone a popular song for the first time. It's like they're teaching Papageno, this is what you're going to sing next. Then he sings it. Here's Papageno's entrance aria. We have the wonderful Simon Keenly side. Papageno's a bird catcher. Orchestra just played the whole tune. Now he'll sing it. See? There is Papageno, and you notice the orchestra did play the entire tune, then he started to sing. So it's as if he did know his music by that point. You'll notice also, I'm showing you clips from productions that are not the one you're seeing today. Everyone embraces this fairy tale sort of environment for this piece. And the Magic Flute is a production that lends itself to going into great theatrical adventure from a design perspective. So you'll notice that this evening too in our production. I mentioned the High Priest Sarastro. There is an element of spiritual sort of writing in this. Notice that the song that he sings here, his aria, sounds very much like something you might hear in church. It sounds like a hymn.
Gesundo Siri schenket dir Weisheit Geist.
Notice the solemn nature of the music.
Im neuen Paar, dir Irrfahrbrach
Zoroaster is also the character that's associated with this idea of Weisheit, meaning wisdom, and ruling through wisdom. And so notice how the music matches that with his character. So we've had opera seria with the Queen of the Night, opera buffa. We've had simple German song. We've had this spiritual sort of music. And Mozart actually looked to the past at one very important moment of this piece. How many of you have read the synopsis about Magic Flute and said, I have no idea what's going on? That was me too a while ago. You say there are too many characters to keep track of. There are these three people, these three ladies, and there's the Queen of the Night, and then who's blah, blah, blah. I totally get it. And I promise you, all is easily demystified just by watching the stage production. It's much less complex than the synopsis tries to lead you to believe it is, I promise you. This next excerpt I'm going to show you features two armored men who figure into when Tamino's going through the trials in Act 2. In Mozart, in showing that Tamino's going through ancient trials of this brotherhood, himself looks back at older music. Bach was a composer that predated Mozart by 50 years, and he then takes a Bach chorale, which shows him looking back to older music, to something before him that he's following in the tradition of, and then puts it into this idea of Tamino going into a tradition of ritual. Starting right here with the strings, this is an actual Bach chorale that Mozart put into this music and then changed the words to once the singers start. You'll notice the music sounds earlier than what we've just been hearing. There are multiple voices. We have different entrances of strings. Another entrance by the basses. It's very complex. You'll notice by using this style of music, which Tamino's getting instructions before he goes through these trials, there's something almost otherworldly about it, something very steeped in tradition. So the example of German chorale. So those are 5 different styles of music you'll hear throughout the evening. So listen for those things. And when you listen to them, don't just notice, oh, that's what Michael mentioned in the preview. It sounds like X, Y, and Z. But notice what it's doing with the character, what their words are saying about them as a character at that point, and how the music actually enhances that. Now, we couldn't have reached this point without looking, in terms of Mozart's composition, without looking at what was happening around him in society and politics, because that influences everything. So you notice the title of this was about fairy tale, Freemasonry, and Enlightenment. So those are 3 major influences on this. I'll give you just a little bit about each little topic, but understand that that's not the exhaustive list as to what comprises the Magic Flute. That's too simplistic, but those are 3 of the major ones. The Age of Enlightenment spanned approximately 1650 to 1800. It's impossible to really put start and end dates to any historical era, obviously. But it was a period of great growth. It was a cultural movement in Europe and also in this country that sought to reform society and advance knowledge. We saw great advances in science. It promoted intellectual debate, and it opposed abuse by church or state, and particularly opposed ideas of the divine right of kings and monarchs, and sought more to have what we would consider to be democracy. Immanuel Kant, who's pictured here, is a great German philosopher who said, have the courage to use your own intelligence, which is actually rather revolutionary at that time for someone to say, this is what we should be doing. Early people who really sparked this movement are very famous people you've heard of. For instance, we have the great philosopher Voltaire, Sir Isaac Newton, and John Locke. John Locke coined the phrase, life, liberty, and property, which sounds very much like the foundation of this nation. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. So it's no wonder that the United States was formed during the same time period that all of this was happening. When we look into German Enlightenment, which would directly impacted Mozart, we look at Frederick the Great, the King of Prussia. And this is a painting depicting how he would rule his court. He had philosophers and writers surrounding him, all talking about these ideas of enlightenment. He said, my principal occupation is to combat ignorance and prejudice, to enlighten minds, cultivate morality, and to make people as happy as it suits human nature and as the means at my disposal permit. He viewed himself as a leader of the Enlightenment, and he was one ruler who did see himself as enlightened and thought that knowledge was the way to advance his society, which was different from a lot of monarchies at the time. One person he did surround himself was a German philosopher with the last name Herder, who believed that every group of people had their own identity, which was expressed in language and culture. And so his idea was then that the German culture could grow, German language could help it, and that could come about by a sense of German nationalism. So you'll notice that the Magic Flute is written in German tonight. Many of Mozart's operas were written in Italian. So by using a language that the people around spoke natively, he was able to communicate many of the ideas that I'm discussing with you in a way that was easily accessible to them right away. German music grew prominently during the period of the Enlightenment. I've already mentioned Bach to you. We also have the composer Handel, who wrote the Messiah. During this great span of time, we cover the periods of the Baroque, the Rococo, into the classical of Mozart. So that's quite a long time to have that happen. Many of you have heard what's called a major scale before, I'm sure. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. If you've seen The Sound of Music, which doesn't seem like anything revolutionary. But prior to the period of the Enlightenment, it didn't exist as something called the major scale or the minor scale. They used, a lot of music was composed for churches, so they used what were called church modes. So to give you, here's an E major scale. Prior to this point, we had all these things called modes. So something could be written in a church mode that sounded like this, which is very different. Now, we couldn't have reached this point if we hadn't had scientific evolution during this period and scientific experimentation, which brought up this idea called equal temperament. It's why we have black and white keys on the piano. It created the sense that we could have all these different sort of chords that sound very much alike. They're all major chords, for instance, but they can start on any pitch. That didn't exist before that. And so because we started having things like major and minor, things like opera started happening. We were interested in form. You've noticed, who's been to Europe? I think a lot of people probably have. You'll notice the famous cathedrals built during this time. There was an emphasis on architecture and form. If you look at the visual arts like painting, there was emphasis on form and design and how things were laid out, and that came into music. Prior to this time, we didn't really have operatic forms. We didn't have things called sonatas or concertos. Those were ways that musicians sought to organize music in the way that the world around them was getting more organized. So all of this was impacting the other. The other big element in this opera is the idea of Freemasonry. And before people run screaming out of the room that I'm talking about the Masons, because I went to Catholic school, so I get it. But Mozart, like most of the influential people at his time, were members of the Freemasons. Mozart was a member for the final 7 years of his life. And as opposed to thinking of the Masons being interested in the occult or things like that, Mozart was part of the group of enlightened thinkers that were interested in intellectual debate, intellectual growth, in being part of a society that was depicting how society both could and should be, as opposed to living underneath a monarchy. Now, that doesn't mean, I mentioned him as being an enlightened thinker. That doesn't mean that Masonry is the root of the Enlightenment, but there are definite overlaps that occur. Masonic lodges, they formed in the way that they functioned, a form of self-government through constitution, the use of elections. All the things that this country is built on were put into place in how the Masons did their business. So it was, again, depicting how some sort of democracy could occur, even though they weren't necessarily living in such an environment at that time in their own culture. French lodges would actually say, as the means to be enlightened, I search for the enlightened. And British lodges would say that their principal duty was to initiate the unenlightened. So you see, we have this whole overlap between enlightened thinking and the Masons. We don't really know the origin of the Masons. If anybody even wanted to venture a guess in here as to when they started, you'd all probably be right. Everybody seems to have an opinion. I put a picture up here of a medieval stonemason because many people trace it back to then. You'll notice also above this stonemason that there's that image of a compass, which was also on the previous slide. It's a major symbol of the Masons. Some people have linked them back as far as Noah. Some people say they're related to the Crusade. Some people say they go back to the Druids, Pythagoras, Moses. So again, take your pick at this point. None of us will ever really know the actual origin. What we do know is that prior to 1717, the reason we don't have that information is it wasn't collected. Once we had the Grand Lodge in England established, people started keeping records within the Masons themselves as to how things were done. The Enlightenment and Masonic ideals. Notice this picture. Does anybody have a dollar bill out there? Have you ever looked at the back of a dollar bill and seen this on it? So if there's still any doubt that there's this idea of Masonry and Enlightenment, enlightened thinking, and enlightened ideas being at the root of this country, just look at the back of the dollar bill and notice how you see the pyramid like this on the reverse side. It's a very, very fascinating thing to look at. Now, I believe that this, we synthesize these ideas of Enlightenment and Freemasonry in this opera. It's too simple to call this piece a Masonic opera. People say, oh, it's a Masonic piece. Too simple, too simple. That's like, you can't say any major piece of music is the result of just one idea. It's, the synthesis of many, many things. As I mentioned, Mozart was a Mason for the final 7 years of his life. He wrote music specifically for his lodge. It was at his lodge that he met a man named Emanuel Schikaneder, who wrote the libretto, or the words that you'll hear tonight. This is a picture actually of Schikaneder himself. He was the first Papageno in the premiere of Magic Flute. Schikaneder was a theatrical performer, he was an actor, he was a singer, big producer. He had his own theater where he was producing works and plays. He was a noted ladies' man who made his way around town quite a bit. So he was very busy. He oversaw the building of the Theater an der Wien. So anybody who's been to Vienna, that was the theater he actually built later in his life. Schikaneder, as I mentioned, was a Mason in the same lodge as Mozart. So when they were collaborating on this piece, you had two people who had these ideas of Enlightenment and Freemasonry in the back of their heads from the same exact lodge. So they were able to really incorporate the ideas and ideals that they were seeking to add to society as a whole into this great work of art. Schikaneder was known for doing large-scale productions. I think if he was alive today, he would be in Vegas or he'd be on Broadway doing these big, gigantic things. It's the reason why his theater was almost always on the verge of closure. He would go after whatever he could find that was most scientifically advanced in production value and go for it, regardless of the cost. So you'll notice, too, the way that the Magic Flute happens with it being a fairy tale and it's an adventure rescue sort of story. It calls for big theatrical production. And you'll see that this evening through the use of pyrotechnics and the big costumes and all of the big set pieces. It's something that when people do the Magic Flute, they know they have artistic license to go big or go home. So it's a good thing we're doing this in Texas, right? In the opera itself, there are many Masonic elements, but the main ones, the number 3 in the use of E-flat major, Masonic symbolism, a quasi-setting of ancient Egypt, or at least Egyptian influence, ritual, and the characters also have a symbolic meaning to them. The number 3 in Freemasonry is a very important number. There are 3 levels of membership. The Masonic initiation ceremony begins with the candidate knocking on the door 3 times in a very specified rhythm that has 3 knocks on each, with each knock. The number 3 pervades the order, and actually there are so many, as it is a secret society, there are the number 3s known to be famous, but only the Masons know every single way that it is very, very special. In the opera this evening, the 3 chords. The opera starts with 3 chords, almost like the candidate started initiation. I like to think of an evening at the Magic Flute almost being like you going through the initiation ceremony from the beginning, as if the orchestra is you knocking on the door. Many people say that Tamino going through his 3 trials throughout the opera is reminiscent of what anybody being initiated into the Masons goes through, and his initiation, if you will, is a metaphor for humanity, going through these trials to try and be a better person and be a more enlightened individual. So you'll hear at the beginning of the opera 3 sets of chords. Then the rest of the orchestra comes in. And suddenly we're into something more tuneful, but we start with these 3 big chords. I'm a product of the Nintendo generation, so forgive me. But you'll hear these 3 chords throughout the opera, especially in Act 2 tonight. Listen for these in Act 2, you can't miss them. You will notice that these chords happen every time Tamino has completed one of his trials successfully. So for me, it's the equivalent of passing the level in the video game and going on to the next level. He's amassed that kind of knowledge. So listen for those, but it's, again, 3 chords. 3 ladies. Actually, these are the costumes you'll see tonight. This is the one thing I gave you a little sneak preview of, the 3 ladies who helped Tamino in Act 1, but we eventually find out they're actually working for the evil queen of the night. 3 ladies. We have 3 spirits who are played by children this evening who guide Tamino along his path to enlightenment. The 3 spirits make only 3 appearances in the opera. Finally, Tamino endures 3 trials on his path to enlightenment. His trials are overseen by 3 priests. What you're about to see is the lovely key of E-flat major. Isn't it lovely? So, that's a treble clef on the far left. You can ignore that for now. But the 3 things in the middle of that that look like the letter B are called flats, if you don't know anything about music. 3 of them. Also, you'll notice how there's the stem on them. In Masonic ritual, there are 3 candles that are lit. Notice how those resemble candles, which are used in this process of initiation and trial. The chords I played you from the very beginning of the opera is an E-flat major. It's the home key of the piece. It's actually what's considered to be the Masonic key. All the music that Mozart wrote for his lodge was composed in E-flat major, no other key, because of these 3 flats. So the symbolism runs very, very deep. Masonic symbolism is throughout. Notice the symbol up here. Notice what's going around this 3-sided geometric shape. A serpent. The opera opens tonight with the Prince Tamino being chased by a serpent that the three ladies then kill. So they even incorporated other elements of their symbolism into this piece. Ancient Egypt. If you've listened to any of the music, we reference Egyptian gods in this. I'm only going to pronounce the names as you'll hear them tonight, so you start to perk your ears up to this. This is the famous image of the gods, as I pronounce auf Deutsch for you, Isis and Osiris. So listen for that from the priest, Isis and Osiris, tonight. Zoroaster will sing about it in his aria at the beginning of Act 2, and then the priests have a whole chorus that start later in Act 2 about that. Some people, as I didn't mention this one, I was saving it for this slide. Other people trace the roots of Masonry as far back as ancient Egypt as well. You also have the use of pyramids, these three-sided structures, which again goes even deeper into the symbolism that we were mentioning. I also can't help but think that Zoroastro, who is the high priest in this piece, is somehow, look at the name, Zoroastro, and then we have Zoroaster from that period. Now, another reason why we can also have this Egyptian influence is because of political statement. I'm sure many of you have seen Carmen, you know, the famous girl who works in the cigarette factory, the seductress, whatever you want to call her. Carmen's a very complex character. But suffice it to say, Carmen is a French opera written by a French composer. Now, Carmen is set in Spain. Why is it set in Spain? Because no French woman would ever behave like that. So if we put her in Spain, it's okay to produce that piece. Look at Verdi's opera Masked Ball, Un ballo in maschera, which talks about the plot to kill a king. So we better set that in Sweden, not in Italy, because then it's okay to produce that piece and it won't get censored. So when you have these people who are talking about enlightened ideas and Masonic ideas and saying, we don't like this idea of divine right of king, we think that sometimes the church is abusing its power, sometimes this government's abusing its power, and we have these revolutionary ideas of democracy. Well, look what's happening over in this place called the United States, or the Republic at that point. That can be a little revolutionary. So if we mask it in a bit of Egyptian symbolism and set it someplace exotic, we can somehow get beyond that. Many people also thought that when Mozart and Schikaneder were designing the role of the Queen of the Night, it was after their own Empress Maria Theresa. And as my grandfather would say, she's a handsome woman in that painting. But you'll notice, the Queen of the Night rules by fear, but Zoroastro, the counterpart to her in this opera, rules by wisdom and enlightenment and calmness and this idea of being very pragmatic and rational in his thinking. So what does this mean for us overall and what you're going to experience tonight? You're going to hear several different styles of music. You're going to see this character named Tamino going through all these trials and meeting different sorts of people along the way. And as he's going through these trials to try and be with his beloved Pamina, he himself grows as an individual. And it's a bigger statement about humanity overall. But something that I find fascinating in closing with you all tonight, so you have to get to your seats and get in there, the Magic Flute is a fairy tale. It's why children can love this piece at a very surface level. It's why I can love the piece at a surface level. I love going to movies like The Hunger Games and Harry Potter just as much as anybody. We all get into an action, adventure, rescue sort of story. So at the level there is that, it's easily accessible to anybody. But when you start to peel back the layers, you can dig endlessly to find out more information about this and go deep into the symbolism that is going on. The Magic Flute involves the audience at a conceptual and an intellectual level. The teachings that Zoroaster has, the trials of Tamino, are one level, but the emotional level between the love of Pamina and Tamino takes it to another realm. What I almost find most interesting about the Magic Flute is that it's a classless sort of opera. Tamino and his friend Papageno, the everyday Joe who I want to drink with, go through the trials together. So in that way, the path to enlightenment isn't restricted to a certain class. Anybody can rise to the challenge and become a better person. I think that's the message that whether people realize it on a conscious level or not, that's the message behind the Magic Flute that makes it special, is that everyone has the opportunity to grow and be a better person. And in this world today, we don't get that message very often. And it's interesting that, well over 200 years later, a piece like this that was written at that time, that idea is still applicable. People need to hear that message still in this world. So it's my pleasure to have had this time with you. I'll ask you one favor, to listen for me this evening as the assistant conductor. Papageno has a magic set of bells. And the bells are realized in the orchestra in an instrument called the celeste. It was originally written for a thing called a keyboard glockenspiel, which doesn't exist anymore, which basically is like a xylophone that's connected to a keyboard. But if you have ever seen the Nutcracker, the Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy, there's that very ethereal sort of keyboard sound. That's the instrument it is. So I will play that in the orchestra this evening. So when you hear, and like everything else in this opera, I only have 3 excerpts for the celeste part. Finally, in grand design, we usually do thunder around here using sound clips or whatever, or we'll just have a sound cue that we push the button and then the thunder plays into the theater system. Not here. I get to go back to old school 1950s B-movie, horror movie. I have an 8-foot thunder sheet backstage that I get to whack the heck out of. So every time you hear thunder, that's because of me. And in case you're wondering, if you ever need some therapy, just hit a thunder sheet. But that's the end of my time. So I thank you very much.